Well, hello, and welcome to today's edition of the FRA Launch Series. My name is Rick West. I'm the head of the lower school at Franklin Road Academy in Nashville. And today I have the distinct honor of interviewing not only FRA parent, but also award-winning children's author, Marilynn Halas. Mrs. Halas, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
It's my absolute pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it's great to see you in this situation. Although we are in different places, I can see you on my screen, and I look forward to our conversation today. So as I was reading more about you and learning more about the Halas family, I realized and learned that you not only were raised in New Jersey, but also spent some time in Northern Ireland. As a former geography teacher, that interests me very much. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I have quite a bit of family in Ireland, also in England. And so growing up, that's where I spent my summers and a fair amount of time.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. You are a wife and mother of 4 children, also an FRA parent, as I said, and you've been in Nashville for a few years, moved down from Connecticut, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit more about your family and connection to FRA?
Sure. Well, I have 4 children. And 3 have attended FRA. When we moved here, my oldest daughter was already a student at the University of Tennessee. And so my second daughter, Elizabeth, graduated from FRA 2 years ago now. And my daughter, Alexandra, now she'll be a rising senior. And my son, George, will be a rising 8th grader. So, and we're very grateful to have found the school, and not just the school, but also the whole community.
Well, that's important to us, as you know, the community aspect. And that's also why we're doing these launch series interviews to introduce our entire FRA community and the greater community to some wonderful parents that we have here at school. You are a former attorney as well as a life coach and most recently a children's author. Tell us a little bit about the steps that you have taken professionally to get to where you are now.
Sure. I think for me, a lot of it was driven by a strong desire for conflict resolution. And so growing up, splitting time in Northern Ireland and in the States and in England as well, when the EU was kind of coming together, I thought that the best place to resolve conflict would be in the courtroom. And sometimes it is. But as I went down that path, I discovered that by the time you get to the courtroom, it can be a little bit too late. And so I went from there to arbitration studies and things like that. And then the more I thought about conflict resolution, the more I realized it really starts in a person's heart and their home, and often when they're very young. So for me, that was a huge motivator. I had always been writing. I've written all my life. I think writers write. It's just part of who we are. And so I decided to spend more and more time with my craft, and that for me has been a huge force in conflict resolution with the young people that I'm fortunate enough to work with. And the adults as well, whether I'm coaching them or telling them a story, that opportunity to model conflict resolution as something constructive that builds a bridge instead of burning it is a real honor. And for me, that's my why.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate hearing the steps along the way to get you where you are as an author. And I'm going to use a quote a little bit later on to tie that back together. So thinking about your work as an author, and that's really where I want to focus our interview today. Can you think back, was there a particular big break that you got, or something that really tipped the scales for you to become an author, and not just an author of one book, but an author of many, many books?
Well, I think in my case, it was a little bit of a snowball effect. It was a lot of little breaks along the way, and I was very blessed with the people that I met along the way who were kind enough to be encouraging. I think the first person that really influenced me was my Aunt Moya in Ireland. She was a huge influence on me. I lived with her when I was in Ireland, and she was a great reader. And at one point when I was very young, actually brought me to meet a gentleman named Seamus Heaney, who has won since then the Nobel Prize for Poetry. And he's from Ireland and was in her circle of friends. And I did not know he was a big shot. I just knew he was very nice, and he had a lovely garden and lots of sweets. But I remember that night, that visit, and I remember his kindness, his warm hospitality and discovering that he told stories for a living. And as a child, I sort of filed that away and thought, well, what an absolutely fantastic thing to be able to do. I never realized who he was until I was much older. So definitely, I think my Aunt Moya, her encouragement. In fact, in each of my novels, there is always a character who has an Aunt Moya. And always, when the character is right up against it, they will remember something wise that she told them. And that sort of helps them turn the tide a little bit. And that's my thank you to someone who is very good to me. And she loved that, by the way. She was a big fan of her characters in those books. So definitely her. I had also fantastic English teachers in high school who were really gifted. I remember I had a teacher and we were studying Beowulf, which can be really dry and hard to get around. And she presented it brilliantly. She presented it like a soap opera. And she would not allow us to bring it home. She read it to us. And she read it and then would stop at a cliffhanger every day. And against all odds, we would all look at each other and really want to know what was going to happen. And you know, this was before the internet, so there was no checking. She would collect books at the end, and that was that. And she was brilliant in that way. So I was fortunate to have teachers like her. I was fortunate to have an Aunt Moya who believed in me. And then professionally, I've been very blessed to work with some of the finest people in publishing in New York City, and to be able to sort of come alongside them and what it is that they do, and for them to be able to find a home for my stories has been a huge blessing. So I think it's all about the people that you meet, and remembering where you're from as you tell stories that will live on past you, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. To be grounded where you are, but also be aspirational in nature. I love the story of an Aunt Moya. That's fantastic.
I hear every day.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we all need those people in our lives, right? That we can relate to, that can challenge us and encourage us. And I'm glad that you mentioned teachers there as well. So I'm assuming you did not go get the Cliff Notes version of Beowulf. I did, because I couldn't make it through.
You should have had Sister Claude, because you would have been wrapped as though it was, I don't know, General Hospital. I mean, she had us convinced that everybody in the play was very good looking and very exciting, and we hung on her every word. And it's all about that. It's all about the teacher in the front of the room. You know, it's bringing these things to life in a way that decades later you remember and you smile. And I think that's what goes into your writing. Maybe you don't write about Beowulf, but you remember how it made you feel. That's what Maya Angelou said. And I think that's so wise, you know. So you try to write stories or paint or write music, whatever it is that is the art that you love. I think when it's good because it has moved someone. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what it's all about.
Did you find yourself writing a lot as a child, even back down to your early elementary days?
Yeah, I'm afraid I did. In fact, I discovered years ago Tupperware containers just full of stories, and may they never see the light of day, because wowee. However, yeah, you know, writers write. And so I always thought I had a lot to say, and I wrote it down all the time. And it's interesting too, because you realize in many ways you've been telling the same story over and again with a little bit more life experience behind you, and a little bit more development of characters who are no longer one-dimensional and flawless, and therefore much more interesting. I think that's true for people too. The most interesting people are those willing to show sort of all of their sides, or at least a few of their sides. And that's something that, one of my favorite things about writing, I think, is that the more you do it and the more you live your life, the more you will be able to express yourself, and the more you'll have to say that will be relevant to someone else, you know, a touchstone. I love the idea that I can tell a story to my great-grandchildren, and I may never meet them, but they'll know that their crazy granny liked to write stories. And I think that's such a privilege, to be able to tell stories to people you don't know is huge. You know, I think that's a privilege.
Absolutely, that is. And I love that you said writers write, because as an elementary leader, as the head of the lower school, we talk all the time, readers read. And we know that the more the child reads, the better reader they will become. And I believe that the more they write, the better writer they will become.
Oh,
and that maturity that they grow up with, and their stories become more full and more rich.
That's right.
Yes.
And I think the other thing is just to encourage young writers or any writer who's just new at this. One of the most intimidating things is the blank page. And something that I have told my own children, and then also in writers' workshops that I work with, what I have always said is just fill the box with sand. Just fill it. Just pour the sand into the box. You can make a castle later, but for now, just fill the box with sand. And I think that's true whether you're writing in elementary school or on the graduate level. Just fill the box with sand. You can always make a castle later. Because once you start to fill the box, then more will come. And what comes next might be what is best. And that's the second part of writing, right, is the editing. And I said second part, not second half, because the first draft is this much and the editing is this much. My first novel had 17 edits. So
wow. Who you we talk all the time in the lower school about our students. We want our students to have another audience for their writing, not just for their teacher. Who were your audiences maybe when you were writing, when you were younger, and through your high school and college days?
So for me, I was very blessed. I have a family. I grew up in a family that loved books and loved words, both sides of my family. And so certainly my grandmother and my Aunt Moya, they would have read anything. I was also very fortunate, again, you know, great teachers. When I was a freshman in high school, I wrote the school play. And to be an unknown and to walk into the director of the play and say, you know, I'd like to be involved. And what he said was, this year we're doing a series of 1-acts. And if you want to submit one, I'm happy to take a look at it. And I did. And I remember, again, just fill the box with sand. I couldn't think what I should write about. I didn't know the school and I didn't want to embarrass myself. So I wrote a play about trying to write a play. And that was true. That's where I was. That was identifiable to the people in the room because they had all tried. And so I think, you know, for me, that's been a huge part of it is just keep knocking on the door.
I love that encouragement. That's something that we certainly want to instill in our students, but even as adults, you know, oftentimes the older we get, the less creative we become, or the less curious we become, and we become tentative, and we don't want to write, or we don't want to speak, or we don't want to sing because we'll be embarrassed. Kids oftentimes don't have that level of embarrassment or that fear.
And not only that, kids also have a wonderful strength in that they're willing to suspend disbelief, you know, and I love that. That's one of the most fun parts about writing for kids versus when I'm working on an adult novel. It's, you know, if you're writing for even young adults, you have to have something to back it up. You know, I wrote a book for young adults called Play On, and Play On is about a kid from New York who gets a secondhand guitar. And when he plays it, he channels the ghost of the previous owner, who is a kid from Franklin, Tennessee, who has gone to Afghanistan after 9/11. Now, you can't just make up a ghost story if you're writing for 13, 14-year-olds. They're smart. They know more about science than I will ever. So I had to go and do a lot of research on string theory and figure out, could I get just enough science behind it to keep a kid who knows more than I will ever know interested in my story? And that's kind of the challenge, and that's the privilege. And then the payoff is, you know, when you get that tweet at 1 o'clock in the morning from some kid who just finished your book and wants to talk about it, that's everything. You know, that means you've touched somebody.
Yeah, that gives me goosebumps. I'm sure it gives you the same reaction.
That is such an honor.
Yeah, I bet. A few minutes ago, you mentioned New York publishers and For Sunflowers Media. So tell me a little bit more about that. You're not just an author, but you have created your own media company. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, I think I have friends who joke it's because I'm an only child. I don't share well with others. I don't know. But I like editorial control. And so I wanted very much to create a company that could publish what I believe in. And part of the reason I started writing for children was when my own children were very small, I would go to the bookstore looking for a book about fill in the blank and not find it. And so I would come home and I guess I'm arrogant enough to think, well, I can tell you a story. And so that's how a lot of the children's books began. And I collected, you know, hundreds of them. And when I had companies interested in publishing my my list, it was very important to me that the list went out. The list is the books that you are ready for publishing. It was very important to me that my list represented who I am. And then if I took on another writer, their work also would be in line with what I believe in. And what I believe in is resilience and redemption, the glory and the struggle, the fact that every human being can rise to the occasion. It's not about particularly gifted people. It's about people who are willing to keep trying. And that flies in the face of a lot of modern dystopian, much more dark stories. I wanted For Sunflowers to be a place of lightness, but not fluff. I want the string theory. I want to prove to you that this is just scientific enough that it could be, but a place that nurtures and enriches people, because what you read affects how you think, and how you think affects how you live, and how you live affects who you are. So it's important, I think, to give kids something to read that is not just further sort of confirmation that the world is a tough, hard place. I like to write stories that acknowledge the world is a tough, hard place, and here's how an ordinary person dealt with that. And maybe that's something that is useful to you as you go on in your own story.
I love that connection, again, tying it all together. Previously, or earlier in this interview, I told you I was going to come back to a quote that I pulled off your website. And it says, and excuse me for reading, but I want to make sure I get it right. Marilynn has seen people survive many tough situations and has used her keen powers of observation and creativity to turn her experience into stories that enchant and inspire children of all ages. In her tips and anecdotes, but especially in her stories, Marilynn infuses a deep understanding of the human condition into fantastic characters and situations that surprise, delight, and reassure her readers. I find that, that was written years ago on your biography. I find that the timing fascinating, because we are in a time of uncertainty in the current pandemic of COVID-19, a time of uncertainty. Are you thinking about how you might utilize your time and this uncertainty to maybe write something else tied to what we're going through?
Oh, absolutely. I think, again, it comes back to writer's rights. So this is an experience that we're all sharing. It's something that it will be a cultural touchstone and reference for many generations who have gone through this. Preschoolers going through this will one day tell their grandchildren about this event. It's a black swan event. It's the kind of a thing that is bound to get your attention. So I do think it will influence many stories to come. I don't know that I personally will write a COVID-19 story. That's something that, for me, if it were to happen, will happen a decade from now. I need a lot of time and space to process and think it through. Again, with Play On, it mentions 9/11. I wrote that 10 years on. And the reason I wrote it was because hearing high school kids sitting at my kitchen table in between their bites of pizza and chugs of Coca-Cola, I heard them ask questions about 9/11 where they basically had very little information. And this had happened at that point. I lived in Connecticut, 60 miles down the road. And it had already become sort of so far in the rear view that they weren't sure it was relevant. So at that point, I felt compelled to let them know who we are as a country, what happened, what the response is. It's like Mr. Rogers says, look for the helpers. A terrible thing happened on that day, but guess what? It's over. And there were thousands of people who went running to help. That is a story that has to be told. My guess is, if I were to write a COVID-19 story, it will again be something that there'll be an impetus for it. And again, for me, it will be about the superheroes, the resilient, the people who ran to help, because those are the stories I really want to tell. Having said that, it's bound to color things I'll write in the meantime, certainly.
I love just seeing news stories every night of our first line responders, the medical professionals, being applauded when they go to work in New York and other cities. Just so impactful, for sure. Thinking about your work as an author, has social distancing impacted you as an author, and have you considered continuing certain things you're doing even after social distancing is lifted?
It has, definitely. I think I joke with my kids sometimes, welcome to 1972. This is how it was. This is, You spent a lot more time with your family. You read books because guess what? Everybody's already online for school, so you can't be right now. Things like that. So I think it's actually really wonderful in a lot of ways. I like cocooning as a writer. Writing is a solitary craft, so it's not affected for me whether or not I can do, if I go to the library to write versus I go to my office to write. What I love about this time is the sort of proximal time we get with our family members that normally we don't get. We meet together each night for dinner, but it's sort of an appointment. I think it's a great luxury that we're having now that we can just sort of pass each other and make each other a quick cup of coffee or go for a walk unexpectedly. That's a luxury that I would love to hold on to. But I understand as life gets back to normal and everybody begins to speed up again and go forward, then they must move forward in their own directions. And I respect that as well. But for me personally, one of the things I've really enjoyed doing is an old writer's habit that I have not done since college. And they're called morning pages. I don't know if you're familiar with that as an idea. So morning pages are quite simply, you have a journal on your nightstand, and when you wake up, you write 3 pages. It's not 3 essays. It's not about spelling. It's not about grammar. It's very much like something William Faulkner would have then published. It is completely stream of consciousness, completely. But it's a great clearing of the decks, because then when you sit down to write something that you're working on, that sand that you shovel into the box is filtered. It is much more focused. It is much more organized because you've already cleared the decks of your mind, getting rid of, whatever it is, I need to let the dog out or whatever it is. And it sounds very pedestrian, but it's actually a really great habit. So anyone who's interested in writing, I highly recommend the morning pages.
Could I start with 3 sentences instead of 3 pages?
You can start with 3 words, whatever works for you. Everybody has their own process,
I love it. As we wrap up, we could talk about this all day long and so many different directions, but there should be an audience of this interview of lower school, middle school, upper school students, as well as their parents. What advice might you have for that wide range of viewers?
I would say every single person is on their own hero's journey. I know you're a hero because even though I may not know your story's particulars, I know your life has not been flawless. I know you've had moments that have been difficult. I know you've had times when you cry, and I know you've had times when you laugh so hard that you cry. That's your story. That's what makes you a hero. Heroes have an arc. They're going along fine, something happens, they rise to the occasion, they overcome, and then they go along fine. That has been your story. So everybody has a story to share. So I guess my thought would be, even if you feel a little bit in your own way, just fill the box with sand. Just fill the box with sand, because you're going to make beautiful castles, and they matter. People you don't know will want to see those castles.
Fantastic parting words there. It just makes it sound so simple, and I know it's not a simple process, but it is a process of just filling your sandbox and then working on your castles.
Yes,
Marilynn Halas, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being a part of the FRA community and sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye now.